G'day everyone, welcome to another edition of Chris Rankin's Music Crush. I'm doing a contest entry today for Jeff Whitcher's Vinyl Destination. I always enjoy watching Jeff's channel, really good, lots of different types of videos that he does as well. Yeah, really good channel, really interesting, not just the same thing, and a pretty broad style of music as well, of everything that he listens to. I also watch the Four Horsemen that he does with Aaron Mutha Alamere, Chris Protfi and JC from the Flip Side. I quite often watch the Four Horsemen that they do. So yeah, I thought I'd enter this contest, and a big congratulations to Jeff for 500 subs. That's really cool, and 1 year anniversary. I can only dream of getting to 500 subs. So really cool. So his contest was show 5 albums that shaped you or shaped your music journey and what you listen to. And I had to think about this a little bit because I do listen to a very wide range of genres. But there are definitely albums or even artists that have shaped me, and then I tried to pick that album that really probably I heard first, or the one that really stood out to me the most. As I've said a few times in my videos, growing up as a kid, adult music was all around me in the 70s. My mum didn't believe in listening to, kiddie music and that sort of stuff, so she was, my mum and dad was in a band in the late 50s and the 60s, and so they were both pretty much into all sorts of music, and then when we moved from the eastern states of Australia to Perth, we would go to my uncle's house and he would quite often play some good heavy music and things like that, and I had 2 much older sisters as well, so they were always playing all the stuff from the 70s, so I got a very good strong influence of adult music at a very early age in life. We also had a show in Australia called Countdown, I guess a little bit like Top of the Pops or any of those sorts of shows. It was a show by Molly Meldrum where he would show all the latest music, and if there was any live clips, a couple of early music videos and things like that, and then he would do like a top 10 at the end of the program of what the top 10 singles were in Australia at the time and things like that. So and that show, I can remember first watching that in 1978. And 1978 was really the year that I really started to hear music and listen to music. I was still a pretty young kid, but I just loved it and just listened to as much as I could, and I always watched Countdown with my sisters to learn and see all these bands, and I loved all the artwork of especially all the prog and the metal bands. And so here we go, let me get started. I'll put a link to Jeff's channel in the description below. So the one that I always think is one of the real big ones for me, my big loves in music are prog, anything progressive, and of course metal as well. They're my 2 biggest loves. I love pop, I do love pop rock, all of that as well. But even in metal, a lot of the subgenres of metal that I love are things that have a little bit of progressiveness to it as well. And I'm pretty sure it comes all back to this album. I heard 2 big songs off this album, 21st Century Schizoid Man and the title track, very early on, and I remember just loving it and loving it and loving it. And I'm talking about this album here. There are other things that I listened to earlier than this. My dad he would have jazz on in the background, he would have blues. My mum would always have Creedence Clearwater Revival and Tina Turner and all that stuff, all the great stuff, the Beatles. My mum went and saw the Beatles when they were in Australia, and so my mum and dad were always constantly having things in the background. And I remember hearing this, I'm pretty sure this was at my uncle's house, not long after we first moved to Perth, and yeah, I just loved it. And every time we would go back to his house, I would say, can you play this? The album with the man with the big face. And I just love it. Absolutely love this record. Of course, it's King Crimson in the Court of the Crimson King. So yeah, this really I put back as day one. Lots of other things that I can't really pinpoint. And the next artist as well was around the same time. But this one, and it really has shaped a lot, because the two biggest, metal is the biggest genre that I listen to, and also prog as well. And those two intertwine consistently all the time. So this is 1969. I'll just quickly show. Of course, I think everyone knows by now, but anyway, it's always good to see the gatefold. Just a fantastic album. I love everything about this album, and it really has shaped everything I listen to. And about that same time, an artist that I heard a lot of early on, I think Space Oddity was probably one of the first songs I ever listened to, but there was also a lot of songs off this album. And early on, not only did I love music, but very early on I loved science fiction, you know, space travel, spaceships. I also had a big love of dinosaurs when I was very little, which just sort of goes into the whole thing as well, I guess, a little bit. So with this album, and I'll show it first of all. So David Bowie, along with King Crimson, but David Bowie really, I just thought he was amazing. From a very little kid, hearing Space Oddity, I used to, in my stupid little voice, just sing as best I could what I knew. And I remember hearing this one just so much. Moon Age Daydream, Starman, Ziggy Stardust, Suffragette City. I used to bounce around the house dancing to Suffragette City. And that was in 1978 when I heard this. Obviously, this is a 1972 album. This is my favourite non-metal album of all time. I absolutely love this album. And David Bowie is my favourite solo artist, my favourite non-metal artist of all time, and pretty close to my favourite artist of all time. And he really shaped so much of what I love about music and listen to music. So much. In every single way, I can go back to David Bowie. As I showed you in a previous video, I have all of his studio albums. Just fantastic. Fantastic artist that just shaped so much. Also around that time, I can still remember the interview that Molly did on Countdown, and it was about 1978. Now, obviously, at that time, I'm that age, I didn't really, you know the year, but you know what I mean. So, but I did trace it back and look, and it was 1978 when that interview was. And Molly introduced a hard rockin' band from England called Judas Priest. And I watched the interview, and he showed some live clips, and they showed some of the thing and the artwork. And the artwork they showed was this. Stained Class. And I remember they played Exciter. They also played a couple of times Stained Class as well. And I think they played Saints in Hell a couple of times on Countdown as well. So this was one of the earliest that I can remember. I'm sure there were other things I listened. I'm very sure that I did hear Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Sir Lord Baltimore, all of the big early heavy metal. But this is the one that I actually remember standing out and I listened to, and that was in 1978. So it was obviously when this album was coming out, because he was interviewing them and promoting the band for this. I may have heard Victim of Change at the same time before, but I can't remember it as vividly as I remembered this and this album cover. Now, this is my favourite Judas Priest album for sure. I absolutely adore this album. I think it's just so good. In fact, all of my favourite Judas Priest albums are the 1970s albums. Not saying that none of the ones afterwards I love, but this is my favourite, and that period is my favourite for sure. I love this album so much. So of course this is what really set that early foundation. I mean, I guess with 21st Century Schizoid Man of King Crimson, it's kind of heavy. Suffragette City, David Bowie, it's kind of rocking. But this is the album that really probably set up my love of heavy metal. And then later on, the first actual album, heavy metal album I bought myself on cassette was in 1981 when I bought Iron Maiden Killers on cassette. My sister helped me buy it. I bought a couple of compilation records, a few of them before that, but Iron Maiden Killers was the first heavy metal album I ever bought, and that was in 1981. And that really, really got everything rolling, even more so. But this is where it really started, and the next few years as a young kid, AC/DC, of course, as well. I mean, in Australia, growing up in Perth, AC/DC was just everywhere. Bon Scott could have almost been the mayor of Perth. You know, we have a statue of him in Fremantle where he lived and grew up. So AC/DC were very strong as well. My mum was a big AC/DC fan back then. So, but there we go. Judas Priest. I did talk about that one for a little bit because obviously heavy metal is my passion and my obsession, and so that album there is as big as it gets, really, as far as shaping me. Now, also, I did hear, I was going to show Michael Jackson Off the Wall because it was a little bit earlier than this album I'm about to show, but I was already sort of, pop was everywhere, and I loved pop, and I can't really single out one album that really shaped that. Probably David Bowie, Ziggy Stardust, which is more of a pop rock album, but it's still, you know, and it just pops everywhere, so it's hard to pinpoint one album that set me up for pop. So and even though Michael Jackson Off the Wall is pop R&B, and that was a massive influence, I just absolutely loved it. All of the Jackson 5 stuff as a kid, just absolutely loved it. And Michael Jackson's still one of my favourite artists of all time. But this album set me up for another genre, and they played the main song off this a lot on Countdown again, and that was they were playing a bit of the single, I reckon, before the album came out, which was about 1981, I reckon. The album came out in 1982, and I'm talking about this beauty. Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five and The Message. This is an original press. Very, very happy to have this. This is a very prized possession by me. She's Fresh, It's Nasty, Scorpio, It's a Shame, Dreamin', You Are, and of course, The Message. Absolutely, I love this album. When I heard the song The Message, so I do have a big love for hip hop. Definitely, I'm quite a big love for it, and I've gone through stages where I've loved it a real lot. Especially, it's funny when heavy metal got really extreme. I really embraced extreme stuff. I loved it, how it was getting heavier and more underground in the early 90s. But I also had a massive love for hip hop as well. I had the two sort of splinter off, and they were my two main loves all through. Especially the early 90s and the mid-90s. I just loved hip-hop so much, along with all my metal. And this is the one that shaped that. This was the one that started that fork in the road of having another genre that I loved of hip-hop and rap. So Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. Just an absolutely perfect album. So, from 1978 to 1987, I was, especially when we got into the 80s as well, early 80s, so I got Iron Maiden Killers on cassette in 1981, and that was the last actual album of Iron Maiden that I didn't buy on the day of its release. So then every Iron Maiden after that I've bought on the day of its release. Cassettes up until until Somewhere in Time. Somewhere in Time I bought on record on its day of release, and all the others since has been on CD on the day of their release. So I was an obsessed metalhead in primary school. I had all the heavy metal logos on my bag. just as much as I could get. Whenever we were playing video games, there'd always be something in the background. Once a week after school, there was about 4 or 5 of us that would meet up at each other's house. I'd bring my my Sharp double cassette player, and everyone would bring whatever latest cassette that they were able to buy from their allowance, and we'd put it in and we'd share and we'd listen to whatever it was. And there was about 4 or 5 of us. And I was just obsessed with heavy metal, everything I could possibly get. And, you know, I thought I knew it all. I thought I knew everything there possibly was. Until one day I went into, which was already my favourite record store back then. I've been going to this place for 40 years, Dada's Records in Perth. And I went in one day in 1987, and I remember the clerk there at the time, saying, "You want to hear something that's going to really blow you away?" And I said, "Oh, yes, please, I'm always looking." And he said, "This is a new band, a reasonably new band out of Florida, and they're playing some very extreme stuff." Wasn't really called death metal, kind of, not really. It was considered just really extreme sort of stuff. And I'm talking about this band, Death. And he played, I can remember the song, he played Zombie Ritual. And I couldn't believe anything could be like this. It blew me away, absolutely blew me away. So this was the album and the band that started the path of my heavy metal going even heavier and more extreme and branching out. And death metal is definitely one of my favourite subgenres of metal, for sure. Death is in my equal top 4 favourite metal bands of all time. And this was the album that started all that in 1987. I just loved it, loved it, loved it, loved it. I bought it on cassette at the time. And since I've got this, I've got all the studio albums they've done, plus the other Chuck Schuldiner stuff as well. Just absolutely blew me away, and it was kind of good timing as well, because it was not long after that Adrian Smith left Iron Maiden, and although Bruce was still there, obviously Adrian would leave after Seventh Son of the Seventh Son not long after this, in 1988, obviously. And I still loved Maiden, but when he left, I didn't like the sound quite as much. Bruce still made it good. So there was some things that I'd grown up loving a lot, that I started to not like as much. And so the extreme stuff helped replace. There was another band and album that I heard pretty soon after this that also helped shape as well. I'm not going to show it because I'm only showing 5 albums, but I have to give a shout to Messiah, Extreme Cold Weather, that famous album with the polar bear on the cover, the blue cover, because that also, along with Death, really helped shape the early extreme. Onslaught as well, but Onslaught were definitely more thrash, even though they did have a song called Death Metal. Obviously Celtic Frost and all, but this was just more extreme and more heavier than anything I'd ever heard before. The lyrics, the artwork, everything. And Messiah, Extreme Cold Weather. Because Messiah, Extreme Cold Weather had a little bit more black metal to it as well. So that set me up for black metal. Even though I'd heard Venom early on before, and Bathory. I hadn't really heard much of Bathory then. It was kind of hard to get here because it was, you know, from Europe and so forth. But so there we go. This is the last one that shaped. So there we go. There's the 5 albums that shaped. There's lots of other things, obviously, but I felt like I always look at those things as the 5 pillars that have shaped my music. And my dad always playing drums. My dad, when he was in the Air Force, was in a pipe band, and he played both the drums, and also he played the bagpipes as well. So there was always bagpipes warming up and playing in the background. And just a family that grew up listening to lots of different adult music. My sisters were always playing ABBA, and they used to have a lot of those compilations of the late 70s, like Teaser 77 or Ripper 1978 or whatever 1976, and they were always playing whatever was the latest things on there. So there we go. That's my contest entry. yeah, I didn't want to make it too long, but I know, Jeff, you wanted to have some sort of story and all about how we are who we are, so that's what I tried to do. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed my story and how I started with all my music and what shaped me, and good luck to everyone in the contest, and congratulations again, Jeff, on the 500 subs. Great stuff. Thanks very much, and I'll catch you all soon.